All right, it's 11:30. We're going to start on time. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining our session today about FIDO perspective in the use in the U.S. federal government. My name is Teresa Wu. I'm your this moderator plus snack commentator on the side. So between Jeremy and Ryan, it's a pleasure to be here. And Jamie Grant will be join from FIDO, but it's also our policy advisor from FIDO Alliance. I serve in the FIDO Alliance as a secretary. I'm on the board, executive council, and I'm also chairing the government deployment working group and the U.S. deployment working group. So quite involved in some of the working group in FIDO Alliance. And then Ryan Caluso from NIST, who is, I call it that the future of identity is in his hand. He didn't like say that I say that to him, but he literally write, like in his hand, he writes the standard that we all are gonna have to live by. So yes, yes, sorry. So yes, our identity future, standard future is in your hands, Ryan. So we're gonna go through several topics about FIDO and the use, how and deploy and use in the federal government. And I'm gonna give the floor to Jamie first to lay out the groundwork.
Great. Well, thanks, Teresa, for the intro. Great to see all of you, and excited to be here talking about FIDO and sort of how the U.S. government and maybe even how governments across the globe are looking at it. As Teresa mentioned, so I wear a few different hats in the Identiverse. My day job is a managing director in Venables Technology and Innovation Group, but I've been working, for 8-9 years now as an advisor to FIDO, helping them largely with policy and government engagement. And people would say it's a little weird for a standards organization to have somebody that focuses on this. But I think what we found in the early days of FIDO as it was emerging was all of us who were working within the Alliance and looking to do early deployments knew that FIDO offered governments and regulated industries better options for stronger authentication. But you had a lot of policies that said use one-time passcodes or use only PKI, and FIDO was new and different. And one thing that's pretty true in our space is as technology evolves, policy regulations need to evolve with it. We've been working really across the globe largely to just spread the good news of what FIDO is and how it works and try to educate policymakers and regulators on this front. And, look, we've seen this in the U.S. and, really around the globe. As I was saying back in 2015 when they first started talking about this, nobody heard of it and everything pointed to other authentication technologies. We're in a really interesting spot right now in 2024, which is that FIDO authentication is not only being recognized as something that you're allowed to use, but it's actually becoming the preferred choice of governments across the globe. CISA here in the U.S. called it the gold standard of MFA in their multi-factor authentication guidance. And, more recently, we've also seen 13 countries, plus the Organization of American States that basically represents the Latin American countries, have all signed on to a set of secure by design principles. Pam Dingle talked about this a little bit yesterday, that, CISA has published. And, it basically states at the top, so we have a screen here that doesn't actually show much, but, the first thing that they're pointing out in terms of secure by design is, it's all right, I'm gonna, oh, look at that. Oh, she's good. You're not seeing what she's doing, but she's making the screen a lot bigger here instead of it just being in the corner.
I'm going to need it, so yeah.
Yeah, so we're all
helping myself.
We all, as we age, our eyesight gets more creative. So it specifically says SaaS providers should be publishing statistics on their internal deployment. This is focusing on industry, what they want commercial software vendors to be doing. What you're doing to deploy phishing-resistant MFA like FIDO, and they should be able to say no staff member can access customer or other sensitive data without authenticating via some sort of phishing-resistant MFA. And you can see the list of countries from basically every continent outside of Antarctica that are now buying into this and pointing to FIDO. And we've seen this more directly in the U.S. government with the issuance of M2209, the White House Zero Trust Strategy for federal agencies a couple years ago, which basically said, look, if you're in an agency or if you're supporting an agency as a contractor, because the U.S. government has, it's not just the employees, it's also the contractors and consultants that work with you. Phishing-resistant MFA is required. For public users, phishing-resistant MFA should at least be an option. So you're coming into a citizen-facing site like login.gov, you should have the ability to use something that is not just legacy MFA that could be phished. And they say the agency's highest priority should be to rapidly implement a requirement for phishing-resistant identifiers, whether it's the government's PIV smart card platform or an alternative method like the web authentication standard from FIDO. And, I just want to dive into a little bit more what the White House said on this a couple of years ago, because I think it's actually pretty notable. For enterprise applications, I think a good thing that the memo did was point out up front, federal government's been using phishing-resistant authentication for years. Smart cards and PKI, that's sort of the OG of phishing-resistant authenticators. But there's a lot of places that PIV's not a practical option. There's a lot of places it's not easy to integrate a smart card or PKI. And so they note that agencies are permitted to be using other phishing-resistant authenticators that might not yet support PIV or derive PIV, and again, pointing to FIDO to meet the requirements of this strategy. This is a big statement, and that a lot of agencies, who've been interested in leveraging different types of FIDO authenticators have been asking, is it permitted? Because there's legacy policies in place that would point to PIV and PKI. This was a pretty strong statement. And, likewise, I thought, the authors of this memo did a fantastic job in pointing out why is it so important to be focusing on phishing-resistant authentication. And, they basically point out the legacy stuff that we're using, OTP, SMS, push. People can trick you now into handing over an OTP code or responding to a push notification. And so if that's the case, and now these attacks can be fully automated and operated cheaply at scale, well, it's time to actually keep ahead of the attackers rather than using legacy stuff that's just not going to work very well. But a policy is great. I think a big question that, we certainly hear from a lot of agencies, and actually, back to the White House's credit in the Office of Management and Budget, they've also asked this question: how can we link policy to execution? And so, two things to highlight there, and I'm going to then hand it over to Teresa to talk a little bit more. The General Services Administration, they led efforts with OMB to create what they call community of action within the government and published a phishing-resistant authenticator playbook for agencies that gets into how you can use different FIDO authenticators, be it security keys or platform authenticators alongside PIV. And FIDO Alliance actually launched its own work group of industry, although government was participating as well, and published guidance last fall to agencies on industry's thoughts on how you can basically leverage FIDO alongside legacy PIV and PKI authenticators. And to talk a little bit more about that, I'm going to hand it off to Teresa in a moment, but I just did want to say there was also this, which Ryan and the NIST team published just a few weeks ago, looking specifically at syncable authenticators, syncable passkeys. If you were in Andrew Shikiar's keynote this morning, you heard a lot about that. And where does that fit into the identity ecosystem? Because if we're syncing key material, that changes some things in the authentication ecosystem. And so that's out there as well. So let me give the mic back now.
Thank you, Jeremy. Actually, next speaker is Ryan. Perfect transition from this one. He's one.
Yeah, I don't have any slides, so I'm just
going
to be
actually, it would be good to look at the history of the FIDO in the standard, right? Not just the last supplement and then come to the last supplement.
Yeah, and I think it's important to, as we start to talk about FIDO, and we've been talking about FIDO, to think about the fact that FIDO is not just one gigantic thing. It's not one monolithic standard. It's UAF, U2F, and there's been this kind of historical evolution within FIDO of different models, different specifications, different protocols being put in place. And I think NIST's history is, going back to 63.3 when we first published it, opening it up at the the AAL3 authentication level to this idea of not every AAL3 authenticator has to be a PIV card. Obviously, we still build these things around the concept of PIV, because PIV is more than just a form factor. It's more than just the authenticator. It's a physical card that can represent you in an in-person scenario. It can be used for physical access control. There's a lot of different things that go with that. So we started to really look at PIV as more the core identity, and then being able to add on to that additional derived authenticators. We've got our derived authenticator guidance. If you like to go through the gigantic numbers of documents we have, it's 800-157. We are in -1 right now, and we're going through an update as well too. But really looking at how can you take authenticators, different kinds of authenticators, and link to that core identity. And FIDO and UAF, U2F have been core concepts in that for quite a while at that AAL3 level. But as FIDO kind of continues to evolve and new concepts come into play, one of the things that Jeremy just brought up was this concept of syncable authenticators. And there's been a lot of really hot debate going on right now, including whether syncable has an H or not in it. I thought it did. However, Andy Regenscheid insisted it didn't, so we ended up not using the H. So I'm wrong often, and I apparently was wrong about the H. So real quick, I guess just by show of hands, who has read the supplement? That's actually pretty good. Okay. Prior to reading it, who had actually heard of a supplement? Okay, that's even more impressive because supplements are a brand new concept, brand new kind of document within NIST's kind of portfolio. I think everybody's familiar with our special publications, our interagency reports, or our internal reports, or any other version of IRs, NIST IRs that are out there. The things like FIPS, our Federal Information Processing Standards. There's a lot of different documents out there. The concept of a supplement is fairly new. And the idea is to be able to give us more flexibility to make changes to our documentation, to our guidance rapidly and in a targeted way to address technology changes, to address threats that might be emerging in the landscape. And as we started to take a step back and look at what was happening in FIDO, what was happening around passkeys, what was happening around all these different kinds of authenticators, we started to think about, all right, where do we go next? How do we potentially adapt to what's emerging within the space? And we realized that maybe this was the first time we would want to exercise this idea of a supplement within the case of our special publication. So a little bit earlier this year, we started to get a lot of questions. So the big question is really, number one, why now? Right? Everyone is probably well aware that we're going through the 863 revision 4 process. We did already make some changes in that core documentation that said, hey, look, we need to start thinking about outside the box when it comes to cloning and syncing of authentication keys. But we really didn't go kind of full bore on the passkey thing yet, because at the time that we released it over a year ago, there's still a lot of maturity that needed to be dealt with in the standards and specifications. But then we started to get a lot of questions from agencies. Can we use these? Should we use these? Do we need to wait until you finish 863 revision 4 to have a good idea of what right looks like with these authenticators? And so we took a step back and decided we were going to give the supplement path kind of its initial shot, its initial work through with the guidance. So syncable authenticators. Why do we choose syncable authenticators and not passkeys as a term here? Mostly because we like to be very difficult. But also because we wanted to make sure that we weren't necessarily bound exclusively to the idea of FIDO, right? There's potential for people to use these kind of authenticators in ways that might, in the future, not necessarily mandate FIDO, passkey, conformity, and compliance. So we went with syncable to kind of represent the overall concept and deal with it in a more kind of broad and general way. Also, passkey's got a lot of connotation around it, and I think there's still some working out of the actual kind of language and representation there on the FIDO side. So that's why we kind of dove in. A syncable authenticator, from our perspective, is any cryptographic authenticator that is, whether it's software or hardware, where you can replicate the authentication key that's stored on there and transition it to a different storage medium other than the original device it was used on. And obviously the intent there, if you're familiar with syncable passkeys or syncable authenticators, is to allow me as the end user to have a key that I can use to authenticate from the various different devices that I interact with relying parties with on a day-to-day basis. Now, obviously, that kind of breaks the core concept of how a lot of authenticators are traditionally viewed. This is a secret. It's a private key. It should be maintained and stored, and it shouldn't go anywhere other than where it was originated. But I think as we took a step back, I think it was very happy that you brought up the federal zero trust strategy. There's a very important aspect of that, and it is getting phishing-resistant authenticators to the general public. And as we started to think through, okay, how is this happening? How is this typically implemented? What are the form factors? We started to realize getting phishing-resistant authenticators out there to the masses, to the end users who needed them, was an extremely difficult challenge if you didn't start to consider models such as this. And so that kind of pushed us into the mindset of, all right, what do we need to think about when it comes to making these things acceptable for use at various different assurance levels. What assurance level does this qualify as? And that's where we started to break down and put together what we consider to be a core baseline set of requirements for what we think syncable authenticators need to meet, some characteristics they need to meet in order to be considered a AL2. And I'm sure there's going to be hot debate and lots of questions, maybe some things thrown at me later. Who knows? But again, I think I want to emphasize the most important point here is being able to offer large-scale phishing-resistant authenticators to the general public and end users. If you want to treat those as software cryptographic multi-factor authenticators and call it good at AAL2, that is your decision to make. If you think you need to add an additional authenticator to it, that is also a perfectly reasonable decision to make. At the end of the day, if we have added phishing-resistant authenticators to more workflows, I think that is the most important thing that we want to take away from this. So whether it's perfect yet or not, we'll see. But at the end of the day, that was our primary goal. And I think that was one of the things that we really intended to build and structure this around. We do know that not every single passkey implementation out there or syncable authenticator out there is going to meet verbatim every single line in this document right now. But we do think a lot of them do. And we do think there is the opportunity to get at least, again, that initial phishing-resistant authenticator out there to the larger population. So that's how we structured it. That's how we kind of put it in place, and that was the goal and intent behind it. Again, I think there's a lot of debate that can still go around some of the core questions, some of the core requirements. We are not doing a public comment period exclusively for this. Again, this has been issued as interim guidance. However, everything that's in here is going to be reflected in 863 Revision 4, which will be out for public comment sometime in the next couple of months here, hopefully. And we will collect public comments, and once we get that integrated into the process, this guidance will be put back on the shelf, and what we have is the final version of Revision 4 will be the final guidance on syncable authenticators. So that's kind of the 10,000-foot view of where we're at with the syncable authenticators.
Thank you, Ryan. Can I have the clicker?
Oh, I don't have the clicker.
You have the clicker. Okay,
Go
thanks.
back.
Forward. Oh, yeah, we can go back first and then we'll go forward. So I'm going to just give a high level on what the FIDO, the latest U.S. government deployment working group has worked on. And so we published this paper late last year. Actually, several people I see in the room that have worked on the in this working group and helped create this paper. Zach, thank you. I'm just the spoke piece here, the mouthpiece here. Actually, as a group effort to put this paper together. In general, the way that we're laying out. So here, my intent is just to give a high-level summary of what this paper is about. But you can download it from the FIDO Alliance website. So at a high level, we are trying to say that there is the permission, the policy permission that Jamie just talked about, the series of different standard document and OMB policy that give your permissiveness for agency to go into actions, to use FIDO Authenticator in the federal agencies. So this is one of them, and Ryan talked about the 157, 863, and of course FIPS 201. Then we are looking at, in the paper, we trying to explain and set the baseline on what that ICANN imperative is about, right? Adopting a single sign-on solution, implementing digital identity risk assessment direct process for the agency, and then adopt integrated lifecycle management, ILM, right? And phishing-resistant MFA is an important part of this ICANN zero trust journey. I think we kind of say that repeatedly. You can't really be zero trust if you are not protecting your authentication methods. So in the paper, if we can summarize it in 2 pictures, because pictures sometimes worth 1,000 words, and I avoid you to read the entire paper, then there's 2 diagrams that I want to share, right? How the agency can start looking at using FIDO. The first thing is pick your authenticator. Like Ryan said, there's multiple form factor. That's not just one. A FIDO authenticator can be a soft app-based authenticator, can be a hardware authenticator, can be in a smart card, just like the PIV, and can be in USB keys, security keys. And so there are multiple form factors. So depending on the population you're using, you're going to have to decide which is the best form factor you're going to use. And then from there, you're going to look at your plan, your FIDO lifecycle journey. So step 2, and then we kind of provided some sub-step on what you need to consider. It determines if you need to bind the record, you need to, what is your authentication flow, your attestation, how you're going to back it up, and so forth. And then you do that planning and then deploy. Of course, I was being told and reminded several times, between 2 and 3, there are also many more steps. But at high level, I think step 2 is the important part, is to plan it out, understanding what are your requirements first before you can you do the deployment. So how is FIDO specific user journey will look like? So in the federal government, there are there are population that PIV eligible population and PIV non-eligible, but you don't really know until you go through the PIV process. And there are PIV non-PIV eligible population that you can issue them a FIDO authenticator straight away. So you start with a non-PIV digital identity record. You create that, and you do in-person proving event. You create a FIDO registration issuance. And if indeed this person needs to be PIV, you go through the PIV process, right? And then you promote that FIDO authentication as a derived PIV. If it's a non-PIV, then you use it as a FIDO authenticator, and then you just have to deal with account recovery or offboarding. So that's at a high level, because we're going to go round 2 of our panel discussion. This is just to level set what the FIDO Alliance has been working on. It's I think we have a lot of session on FIDO already, so I don't have to explain what FIDO is. But it seems to me is when you put FIDO in the title, people show up. Just saying. Just what I noticed. So
I think it's just me.
So next year, Eve, when I'm going to submit, I'm going to make sure I put like FIDO somewhere on my presentation titles. So this is round 1, level set, because we want to make sure not everybody know PIV, know how it makes sense in the federal government. And I'm going to go in the round 2 of the discussion. It's really about the value proposition, why FIDO, right? Not that we are all engaged in FIDO, that's why it's cool. So Jamie, what do you think the benefit or the value proposition of FIDO?
Well, I think it's a couple things. I mean, one, we've talked about the obvious, which that, outside of PKI, maybe a couple proprietary things that are out there, it's the one standard that can actually deliver phishing resistance. And that's becoming a security imperative. I think beyond that, depending on how you're deploying it, it can also do it in a way that actually significantly enhances the user experience. And that's quite notable as well. I think one of the challenges that, not just agencies, but the broader market has sometimes with FIDO is the way it's implemented is not one thing. It's actually a very flexible standard that can support a lot of different form factors and different authenticator assurance levels. So, there's been a lot of talk the last month since the NIST supplement about, wow, they're recognizing syncable authenticators with some conditions at AAL2. FIDO also supports AAL3 with things like, FIPS 140 validated security keys. And so that is, I think, still going to be my take, particularly in the government enterprise, what you're going to see agencies defer to first as an alternative to PIV and PKI, or in some cases you've got firms like Ubico that you can carry both PIV and PKI and FIDO credentials on one device. But then as we start to look to how do we start to get phishing resistant authentication, how do we deliver passwordless, for say citizen facing applications, this I think is where you're going to start to see more of a focus on embracing what you're now seeing emerge in the marketplace with synced passkeys. And so, understanding FIDO can, again, supports multiple devices, multiple form factors, multiple assurance levels. You shouldn't be looking at it one thing, looking at it as one thing. One of the things I loved about the FIDO paper that they put out was, again, focusing on, hey, let's start with the digital identity risk assessment. What is the challenge we're trying to solve? What are the risks? How do we actually, balance that across, other choices in terms of authenticators will, allow or not allow, or when it comes to, citizen-facing services, offer or not offer. and then you can choose the appropriate type of FIDO authenticator for that transaction.
Thank you, Jeremy. Yes, you're right. When we did the risk assessment, actually, when we were doing our prep, Ryan, you talk about like we need to like design our authentication based on the threat we are facing and not based on like standard. So that was a very interesting discussion. Do you want to just like do a little overview?
To clarify, I didn't say not on the standard. I think the focus is on what we'd like to do in the future, what we'd like to do with all of our kind of risk management guidance is the assurance levels can only achieve so much, right? And if you're hyper-focused on compliance and checking the block and achieving AAL 1, 2, and 3, IAL 1, 2, and 3, you're probably missing the point, right? You need to really focus on, all right, these provide a baseline of expectations for how you can manage and communicate risk at a certain level. You also need to go in and understand what real threats you face, what real attacks you face, and be able to apply authenticator types, identity proofing processes, batteries in microphones, in order to be able to actually mitigate the real threats that you face. And I think that was one of the things that we really try and focus on when it comes to our update to 863 revision 4 and the base volume. It's also what we tried to focus on in the supplement as well too, looking at, okay, what are the threats we're trying to mitigate at AL2, and how does that compare to what syncable authenticators do and do not do? That does not mean it is a cure-all. It means it is another option that can be reviewed and evaluated and understood from a trade-off perspective when deciding how do I want to apply authentication to my end-user use cases. And again, I think Jeremy bringing up the optionality of FIDO and the FIDO protocols and specifications is incredibly important, right? Like, we put out a specification. We put out a supplemental document that is not intended to say hardware keys and device-bound keys are bad. They're gone. No more. Don't use them anymore. That's not what we're saying. We are saying that these things can be used for a very small subset of lower to moderate risk applications. If you have high risk applications, you probably still need to be looking at that AL3 use case, at that non-exportable cryptographic authenticator. So this is not intended to replace or be used, or to say syncable authenticators should be used for every use case. They should not. They are not appropriate for every use case. But we wanted to remove the barriers that exist in revision 3 to allow for a more robust evaluation of these kinds of authenticators in your end user implementations.
Yeah, actually, in the FIDO paper, we started that FIDO paper the same thing, saying that let's be like clear and crystal clear. Like FIDO is not a substitute or going to be replaced PIV. It's in complement to PIV. So even FIDO Alliance sort of have that official position about it, even though I think there's a lot of wish that maybe can be do the same. But like you said, PIV does many other things than FIDO does. How about UX, Ryan? What do you think the FIDO? You just talk about the friction, right? The large scales. Is it because with passkey you feel like the UX experience is much better, or?
I think practically speaking, it can be much better than using a username and a password and an SMS OTP. It's painful, it's time consuming, and it's less secure. I think the potential for what a syncable authenticator to bring and how we're seeing them deployed now is such that you can have a much more streamlined user experience, and you can hypothetically have a more secure user experience as well too. So I think the idea that you can get both those things in one package with one kind of set of specifications, standards, and authenticators, I think is incredibly valuable. I do think from an overall user experience perspective, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to make that a consistent feel, a consistent look, and a consistent interaction, so that end users understand what's happening when they're using their passkey, how it functions and how it operates, and do some education as well for those end users. But I mean, again, there's also still a lot of work that needs to be done on the standards and specifications as well too. I'm sure at some point in time, someone's either going to ask the question, so I might as well bring it up now. This concept of attestation and the concept of provenance. If you don't sufficiently trust all the implementations that are out there, you may want to add an additional authentication factor. That's a perfectly reasonable risk-based decision for an agency or an organization to make. But you do need to understand that it's going to modify and implement something that's going to change that user experience, right? You're going to have to add an additional authenticator that's not going to make things as smooth. ideally, we would love to get to the point where everyone is sufficiently comfortable and confident with implementations that we don't have to worry about that. We don't want it to be the standard user experience that you have to use a passkey or a syncable authenticator and then something else. But again, I think there's still a lot of work to do from an attestation and provenance perspective before we can necessarily have everyone comfortable with that. Now, again, I think that ultimately relies on the risk-based decisioning and the risk appetite of the agency as to whether they want to have to add something additional to it or not. And it's also going to depend on what you envision as being your kind of ultimate end user base. Do you think 99% of your users are going to come through with a really strong implementation? Maybe you're willing to accept the risk of those smaller percentages. But that's a risk-based decision that's going to rely on who the organization is and how they want to manage that. But most importantly, that phishing-resistant authenticator can get into that individual's hands. And ideally, in the future, we can have a pretty streamlined user experience for that end user.
Can I just dive in a little more? Do you want to go?
Yeah, actually, I want to ask you, Jeremy, because this panel discussion is about FIDO being used by federal government agencies, right? So your knowledge, and I want to do a shameless plug with your talk later, right? There are federal agency using FIDO authentication, may not be passkey, but syncable authenticator. But there are use case and deployment of FIDO authenticator in the U.S. government.
Yeah, and to be clear, agencies have been using FIDO long before the OMB memo. I think login.gov back in 2018, along with Yahoo Japan, those were the first two large-scale sites to deploy FIDO2 when it first emerged. And so you've been able to, use a variety of different types of authenticators with login.gov for ages. Now, that can also now be a syncable passkey. If folks are that's the authenticator that they have and they're choosing to use. Likewise, we've seen gobs of security keys used across the government, in many cases as a way to either be an alternative form factor for the PIV or leverage FIDO where it's not easy to integrate PKI. So there's a long history. I think it was back in 2017 or 2018 the DoD CIO put out a memo that specifically called out YubiKeys as an alternative in the old FIDO U2F standard. But we're now at a point now where I think we've gone from early adoption to this imperative of, holy crap, all the legacy MFA we've been using is, Teresa just said crap. So, yes, the attackers have caught up. That's the nice thing to say. We keep innovating on the security side, and then the attackers innovate too. And they've now found ways to get beyond it, and so the priority really has to be phishing resistant. But a couple things on that point. To address the topic around attestation and provenance of keys that Ryan was talking about before, syncable passkeys are emerging in the ecosystem, but depending on your passkey provider, they might be implemented differently. And there's a lot of work ongoing right now in FIDO Alliance. Definitely some spicy discussions. I feel like we got a lot closer to some potential answers in the plenary in Osaka last week to try and address. To get to the point, the NIST supplement, points out you are AAL2 not for any syncable authenticator, but if you meet a few conditions. Well, as a relying party, you might not actually be able to know whether a passkey provider is meeting those conditions or not, unless they're able to pass through something about themselves and the additional controls that they have in place. And so I think that's one place where, there's still some work to do. And, to that point, some agencies might take a risk decision when it comes to syncable authenticators that, okay, we'll use it as a password replacement, but we might want to layer something on top for some transactions depending on risk. And so I think, that's an important item to note in terms of things. But, the flip side of that, in terms of where I think agencies should be looking to use synced passkeys today, certainly in the consumer space is, and there was I almost excerpted this in my slides but didn't, there was a great point you guys made in the supplement that I loved, which to the point Teresa said before about a lot of the legacy stuff is crap. You said every other authenticator we permit at AAL2 today can be shared by somebody. So if I can now share a cryptographic key that happens to be phishing resistant, what are we arguing about here? This is just something that's new that actually has the benefit of better UX and it's phishing resistant. And yes, it's shareable, so there's some risks there, but we're not saying it's AAL3, it's AAL2. Take advantage of this. This is a new gift to agencies that industry has bestowed upon them. You should be using it. You didn't say that last part. That was my editorial.
Thank you, Jamie. All right. So we're going to switch a little bit direction in the discussion. because another hot topic I realize is that if you put mobile ID in the title, you get more and more people joining your session too. So we're going to talk about mobile ID a little bit. So how is FIDO and relates to mobile ID or mobile driver license? How you see these two things evolve in the for the U.S. Government?
So I think it's a really good question. I'm pretty sure Bill Fisher's back here somewhere. We also have our mobile there he is. We also have our mobile driver's license project that's going on at the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. And one of the core conversations we've started to have internally as we add things like mobile driver's license to our guidance, and we start to think about these concepts of how often do we really want to be presenting our mobile driver's license for authentication? How often do we want all the attributes that might be associated to getting passed across to those relying parties? How do we prevent the relying parties from asking for attributes when they don't even need them? And so I think there's a concept that we've started to think through about the idea of being able to basically have that kind of mobile driver's license, verifiable credential concept living there as your how do I prove identity? And then potentially something like a FIDO authenticator, and I'm not saying it's a passkey or not, I'm saying a FIDO authenticator that can ride along as your longer-term authenticator that is purely there for proving that you're the same person who participated in registration. So that's one of the concepts we do want to look at within the Mobile Driver's License Lab. How can these two protocols and concepts live alongside each other? Where are there potential issues or challenges, and what does an actual implementation look like? Again, I think there's bigger questions in a kind of more theoretical realm about mobile driver's license and how often you really want to be using that as your kind of presentation. And again, I think that's where we start to ask the question of how do these fit together into a more cohesive view of digital identity and wallet-based identity in the future.
Yeah, a couple of points on that. One is I think there is an emerging debate in the identiverse right now around there are some people who are saying if I've got an MDL on my phone, if I've got verifiable credentials, well, there's a certificate that's tied to that. That's a phishing-resistant authenticator. It could be used as one. Why would I bother to mess with FIDO when I can just leverage the certificate that's on this? My take is that's a pretty bad idea, and I don't think most RPs are going to want that. In that, one of the nice things about FIDO is you're actually generating your own key pairs, and you manage them. And the idea of tying back authentication every time to something that is being issued by a government, I really think it's important to separate identity proofing, identity verification from authentication. I'll go further, I need the government to help me prove who I am because the government's the only authoritative issuer of identity. And so being able to invoke something like my MDL when I'm applying for a government service and they need to know who I am, or I'm trying to open a new bank account, that's when I want to be able to ask the government to vouch for me. Authentication, I don't think I want government anywhere near that. But there's a spicy debate, and some are arguing that this may be something that companies are going to want to embrace. So I think we'll see how that plays out, and maybe there'll be a talk of a topic next year at Identiverse. I think the second place where FIDO can play a role is one of the big questions around mobile ID in general is, okay, what if I have multiple devices? Or what if I lost my device that had this thing cryptographically bound to it and now I need to recover it? And we're seeing this emerge a little bit in Europe where they're more than a little ahead of us, I think, in thinking about digital identity strategy right now with the EU digital identity wallets, where this initial idea of, we'll just have it bound to one device. People are now going, well, geez, what if I lose or need to replace my device? And one of the pilots that's underway right now is actually leveraging FIDO authenticators as a way to access a cloud-hosted wallet that you could then use it as a root of trust to reincarnate your wallet or your digital ID that was on one device onto another. And so I would say I think FIDO authenticators or some sort of portable authenticator is going to play a really strong role as we start to see portable digital identities emerge across the globe. Because look, getting back to why are platforms suddenly deciding that they want to sync passkeys? Because if you're building systems based on possession of cryptographic keys, nobody knows how to manage cryptographic keys. And more importantly, consumers don't want to be asked to manage cryptographic keys across multiple devices. And so, syncing was sort of the logical response of, gosh, we always said for years you should never clone and export keys, but dang it, if we're actually going to replace passwords with something, we need to do that. So okay, let's bite the bullet. The security benefits still outweigh the risks, and we can, hopefully do some stuff with attestation and other things to potentially address some of the risks that comes with syncing keys. As I said earlier, more to come on that. But I think we're seeing this now emerge, again, with MDLs and decentralized identity, verifiable credentials. So many of these architectures are dependent on the idea that people are going to know how to and want to manage cryptographic keys. And yeah, that's not going to happen, but I think there's going to be a role for FIDO authenticators in making that ecosystem more usable.
Thank you, Jeremy. Just another shameless plug. The European Working Group of FIDO Alliance did publish a paper on how to use FIDO Authenticator in complement in the framework of EU DAS, right? The European digital identity framework. So also can go check it out. I think there's a lot of a good baseline on how those digital ID and FIDO authentication can complement each other. In my personal, part of my other job that I do outside of FIDO is that I oversee all the mobile driver license program deployment in North America for IDEMIA. And if you haven't attended the MID session yesterday, I would say that the ENVA have talk about some really staggering stat about state deploying mobile driver license. So there is 69 jurisdiction in North America that's under the ENVA jurisdiction. So the 51 jurisdiction in the U.S., the 10 provinces in Canada, and then all the U.S. territory, and that's 69 jurisdiction. And out of the 69 jurisdictions, 17% of them have one form ISO or pre-ISO mobile driver license, right? Digital IDs. And another 28% is in the process of deploying their mobile driver license. So add it up, out of the 69, we have almost half the jurisdiction is going to come having a mobile ID coming online, right, in the coming year. And then you have another 30-something% are working with the legislature to deploy mobile ID as well. So I think the digital ID landscape in the US is going to change quite a bit, even though I think it needs a little bit more national, federal strategy in terms of investment, right?
Come to my 4:30 talk on that later today.
Exactly. I'm trying to do a lot of shameless plug. I hope you don't mind, but try to brief this. So there is how these two combine together. I think and also is the identity for the life cycle. You listen to Andrew's talk earlier, right? FIDO authentication, it's only one piece, but knowing who you're issuing the authenticator to is equally important, right? So that's why FIDO work on identity verification, the face, and the identity proofing and verification process. And MID is going to play a very strong, have a strong benefit on that, right? Because now you can use MDL, MID to do identity verification in a very deterministic manner. That's Bill taught me that term. Love it. So I keep using it since. Instead of probabilistic manner where you are using a document, you try to guess with a score risk, if it's really the document that belongs to the person, it's probabilistic, right? So the MDL is going to change that and makes that whole, I would say, that FIDO life cycle even stronger. So that would be my how those two relate. All right, we have 7 minutes left. I like Jeremy and Ryan. So we'd like to do a key takeaway. So if you just come in and didn't or you slept through our session, which I'm gonna give you a very, very dirty look. That what you need to, we want you to walk away from this session. First, the NIST supplement is out. Go check it out. And there are tons of FIDO resources out there. You can go check it out on the website. And that do not hold back on authentication options. Don't hold back, right? It's just ditch OTP already. Don't hang on, please, just move on. and collaboration across our government agencies. So this actually is something that coming from our GSA friends, right, with the community of interest, community of actions, where deploying FIDO authentication in U.S. government, it can be very challenging. It touches many moving parts, and so oftentimes you need collaborations and knowledge and sharing, and that will help the next deployment better. And so that was another key takeaway we have. Jeremy, you want to add another key takeaway?
I think the last thing I would add is that, and we sort of touched on this earlier, I think what's really important to me about M2209, the White House Zero Trust strategy, is going back to 2004 when HSPD 12, Homeland Security Presidential Directive 12, was issued, basically ordering the creation of the PIV card, 20 years ago now. The federal government has largely been in sort of what I would call a PIV or bust mentality in many agencies, where because we said this is the gold standard, and it is. I mean, it's an amazing thing. A lot of things you can do with it. Everybody should be using it. And then we kept kind of ignoring the fact that there were a lot of people who weren't eligible for a PIV or just use cases where you couldn't easily integrate it. And all of that stuff was in many cases protected with nothing but a password or some sort of a weak authenticator tied to it. And so to me, the biggest sea change is the White House saying, the PIV's still important, but we're actually not overly concerned with what you're using to authenticate into an agency resource as long as it's phishing resistant. You've got that additional flexibility. Take advantage of these new gifts that the market has bestowed upon you, federal agencies, and look for ways to leverage the broader ecosystem of phishing resistant authenticators. PIV's still cool. Use it where you can, but take advantage of other things like FIDO where you can't.
I mean, I would say I think the work is ongoing, right? I think there's a lot that we still need to do, but I think from the perspective of being able to scale phishing resistance in a way that we probably didn't envision it about 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, I think there's a lot that has been done. So I think we need to continue to work to get these things into people's hands while continuing to finalize the concepts and the supporting structures that are going to allow for them to be used more effectively in a more ideal way going further in the future.
Well, thank you. And we have 3 minutes for questions.
Only questions for Jeremy.
Who want to ask questions?
Nobody wants to ask questions.
No questions.
You've got the guy who owns digital ID at NIST up here. You can ask him a question. There we go.
So in 5 years, what's going to be the topic that's beyond phishing resistance?
I mean, yes, we have the post-quantum stuff that we have to figure out, and I'm not on the PQC team, so I'm not a cryptographer, so I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on that. But I think that's we're going through the process of identifying and standardizing the PQC algorithms. I think 5 years from now, it's going to be conversations about how we go from where we are now in the standardization process into the how do we start to implement it, where do we implement it, what are the priority use cases, and how do we deal with legacy risks and vulnerabilities. Not exclusively an identity thing, but there's certainly overlaps and impacts from the identity perspective and in the identity space.
I'll say I actually think we're going to be having a lot of the same conversations in that I think MDLs are going to proceed very slowly in the states right now. If there's not more coordinated federal action to try and drive sort of a vision of what good looks like, do more than, what NIST is doing with the NCCOE work on MDLs is nice, but it's like about 2% of what we need to really accelerate this, particularly at a time when...
You can give us 5% maybe?
5%, all right, 5. I'll give you 7. Well, we'll see how you do.
With Bill, come on, 7%.
We'll see what you all deliver.
Let's negotiate.
But no, the way it's a great start, but I think there's a lot more that's needed if we're going to really accelerate on the identity verification side, ways for people to have something that's backed by the government to, essentially ask the government to vouch for them in transactions. And I think it's going to become more acute as AI-powered attacks ramp up in that, I've pointed out a number of times, like biometrics, it's going to be interesting to see which ones can stand up, but the one thing that AI can't defeat is public key cryptography. And so if I have a credential that's bound to public key cryptography, now, mind you, when AI gets married up with a post-quantum computer, we'll all be bowing down to the machines and they can put on Identiverse themselves, will be irrelevant. But
they were summarizing it.
Yes, it's being summarized here. We'll see if the AI gets mad at me for saying that. But I think that's going to still be a big issue 5 years from now, is just how do we start to accelerate this? I'm pessimistic. I think we're going to see the attacks only ramp up from where they've been, and the numbers get worse. And so it's going to be a priority to accelerate that.
Okay, sure.
I
can have the last answer. Okay. So I have the last word.
You hold on to that so you get the last word.
I get the last word.
Okay. I think the other thing we'll start to have to understand is as attacks shift, like as we start to look at mobile driver's license, as we start to look at syncable passkeys, where are the attackers going to start moving next, and how are we going to be prepared to harden some of those things like state level infrastructure and the sync fabrics that are out there that are going to be part of this? I think you're going to start to see the attacks going from directly at the ruling party websites and directly at the kind of the remote identity proofing processes, shifting more towards the kind of sources of truth on a lot of those things. And that could be a pretty dynamic paradigm that we need to start preparing for, I think, now.
So great questions. I like that 5 years from now questions. In my opinion, definitely post-quantum migration, even though it's not, in itself, it's not identity topic. Migrating identity management to post-quantum, it's critical because it's one of the key enabler for the overall migration. You have to migrate the people and the credentials. So PQC post-quantum will be one of the hot topic, I think, in 5 years. And then the second topic, I think in 5 years will be sort of, okay, now the state are issuing mobile driver license. But I think 5 years from now, we want the state to help enabling identity verification, like the access to source of truth. Instead of having all this identity verification services that it's only looking at a document that with deepfakes and forge and all that, it's less and less trustable. And with generative AI, or quantum computer, if they ever come in, then what is the right way to verify identity? And I think in the U.S. that's the DMV, the public, the state government, and how you can work with the state government to verify that identity. I think that will be one of the topics. So other way to verify identity.
Can I just say, appreciate that we waited until 60 minutes in to use generative AI in the presentation. So
I try very hard. All right. Well, thank you for.
We have time? I don't know if we have time.
It's lunchtime, so those that want to stay a little bit, couple of minutes.